When we think about addressing moral distress and burnout in our healthcare settings, we really have to think of two sides of the same coin. One side is organizationally, leadership, culture, workplace setting. How do we set up a workplace that helps to avoid burnout because of the effects and what we know that does? And then the other side of it is personally, how do I avoid burnout, or if I'm already burned out, how do I recover from that? So what I want to talk about in this video is the organizational path, the steps that organizations really have to take to be able to address burnout, to avoid burnout. These aren't just nice to. This isn't just, oh, aren't we a caring organization that we're doing these things? Aren't we nice? Isn't this extra? No, it's core now. It's absolutely essential. It's unacceptable to have an environment that fosters burnout because of what it costs the organization, what it costs the patients and the residents, what it costs the healthcare system, our community, that sort of thing. So when I tell you that these things are necessary, I don't mean necessary psychologically, socially, emotionally. Certainly, they're necessary in that way, but they're really necessary for the functioning of our organizations, of our healthcare system. So let's think of that from the organizational standpoint. I'm going to give you 7 steps that an organization can take to avoid, alleviate, and even press rewind a little bit on the burnout that's happening for their coworkers. And only a couple of these are actually difficult, and there's only one or two that actually cost money as well. So number one, the first step that an organization can take, or you as a leader can take, to avoid or decrease the level of burnout for your coworkers is to give the option to opt out at times. So we can identify, when we talked about moral distress, we talked about our own inner values. Sometimes as leaders, we can see that a certain situation is going to be very distressing for that one particular coworker or that certain group of coworkers. And we can identify that, and then sometimes we can offer the opportunity to opt out, to say, this is so distressing for you. I'm going to have coworker X over here instead of coworker Y do this, because we are all different and not everything transgresses our values in the same way. And so sometimes, obviously, we need to continue to provide services. So I'm not saying we opt out of providing services, but can you give an individual coworker, an individual leader, a small group of people? Sometimes they won't actually take you up on the option to opt out, but if you'll just verbalize, like, hey, if this is too heavy for you, if you don't feel like you can do this, I don't want to force you into something that's going to transgress your values or something that's going to hurt you. That's going to be, not that it's going to be hard, because work is hard, but that it's going to be hard for you, like in a soul level way. If you'll communicate that to them, I would guess more often than not that coworker is going to continue and go ahead and do that and actually not opt out, but just the knowledge that you care enough to say, I don't want to put you in that situation, can be a big deal. So the first step organizations can take, leaders can take, is providing that option to opt out. Second of all, and similarly, sometimes we can't opt out, right? Sometimes it's happening too quickly, it's right in front of us, or it's a system sort of thing that happens all the time, everybody's got to deal with. But when it's significant, instead of having people opt out, we can take a timeout. We could say, you know what, let's just acknowledge. Acknowledgement is huge. Let's just acknowledge that when that patient came in and that thing happened, that was hard for us. Particularly those of you that were maybe hands-on with that patient, or those of you who were attached to that patient, or that resident reminded you of a family member, that sort of thing. So taking a time out, acknowledging, and this doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to have a certain formula. It could be in a staff meeting. It could be in a huddle. It could even be over an email sometimes, and say, let's take a second to acknowledge how difficult that was. Unacknowledged stress multiplies. And so if you can acknowledge that stress, acknowledge that moral distress, it will divide that and reduce that down. Number 3, and really the most significant, I suppose I should have this as number 1, but this is the most significant way to avoid and alleviate burnout in your coworkers, is to have leaders who listen. I'm going to say that again. Having leaders who listen is the primary, and research backs this up. All the studies show that if a person feels supported, and that support usually looks like feeling heard, by their leader, by their organization, even if they're going through really difficult things at work, even if the moral distress is like off the charts, they are less likely to trickle into burnout. Um, excuse me, less likely to have the impacts of burnout, um, because they feel supported, because they feel heard. And so, if you're a leader and you have a one-on-one with a direct report, and you're just talking the whole time to them, you're doing it wrong. It needs to be a time where you ask them about things, obviously, even how they're doing personally. Let them talk. You will be amazed how people will think you're a great leader if you can do this one thing. If in your meetings individually, if in your meetings in smaller groups and huddles, you do a great job listening and hearing, even if you can't resolve or fix any of the things that they're concerned about, if they feel heard and they feel like you care, that's going to change things dynamically for them. So if you want to grab one primary dial that's going to help you to turn down the impact of moral distress, of the workload, the staff shortages issues, all of those things, is to really hear. And don't just say you hear, but hear and listen, remember, ask follow-up questions, and as they feel heard. You've experienced this. You've had leaders who couldn't care less about you, that didn't listen to you at all, and that job was very stressful, is my guess. You've also had environments where maybe you worked really hard, extra hours, really stressful stuff, but you had a leader who cared about you, and you could continue on because you felt supported. You know the difference, you've experienced the difference, and now we've got to live that difference. So step number 4, for organizations and leaders, ways to dial down the impact of burnout, is well-being programs. So formal structures that support the well-being, honor the well-being of their coworkers. These have been shown to increase patient satisfaction. So there was a study done with the community healthcare system in Indianapolis, where they implemented a well-being program for physicians, and then those physicians that participated saw their patient satisfaction scores rise. So go figure, there's a correlation between how good I'm doing personally as a clinician and the kind of care that I'm able to provide with my clients, my residents, my patients, etc. A warning about well-being programs, though: if you're requiring long hours, leaders don't care, people aren't really supportive, the wages are horrible, turnover is happening every other day, quality events, errors, etc., and then you say, here's a gratitude journal because this will alleviate your burnout, keep your head down, because that gratitude journal might just come flying back in your direction. These are band-aids. They can't resolve all of the core issues. But I will say, I correlate well-being programs to parachutes. People notice when they're missing. So if you don't have a parachute on the way down to the ground, you're going to notice. If you don't have a well-being program, people are going to say they don't do anything to care for us as people. They don't provide anything that says, how are you doing, how are you coping, etc. Chances are you could develop the world's best well-being program, and only about 8% of your coworkers are really going to take advantage of it, which is why I say it's not something that's going to solve the problem. But when it's absent, 100% of your coworkers are going to notice that you're not doing anything to invest in their well-being. So that was number 4, the well-being programs. Number 5, non-punitive ways. Organizations can have non-punitive ways for coworkers to admit when they're struggling. In other words, if I'm having a hard time, if I feel disengaged, if I feel depressed, if I feel frustrated, if I feel this moral distress that we've been talking about, is there a way for me to raise my hand and say, I'm not doing as well as I'd like to be, or I'm not doing as well as I used to be, or I can't do quite the same level of job that I used to do because of the way I'm struggling? Is your department, your team, your facility, a culture where people can raise their hand and say when they're struggling? Do you reiterate it over and over? The default setting for coworkers is to not feel comfortable saying that they're struggling. So you've got to work hard to make sure that people feel as though they can. So formal ways, having an employee assistance program that they can reach out to anonymously, and then you as leaders or as coworkers, you talk about how that's a viable option, a valuable option, and that maybe even something that you can share. This is something I've taken advantage of before. When I went to see a counselor through our employee assistance program when I was working for a large healthcare system, I eventually, not right away, because it was my private, things that I was going through, I eventually shared with my coworkers that I was seeing this counselor. And after that, and I don't know if that's the reason for it, but after that, I saw a lot more of my coworkers start to go see that counselor as well, because they knew the guy who was telling them that he was making use of this wasn't going to punish them if they were making use of that sort of tool as well. So we want to create an environment and reiterate to our coworkers over and over, hey, if you're struggling, let's take a time out. Let's find a way to help you. It's okay to say that you're not doing well. And then similarly, but different, we've got to have non-punitive error reporting options, because when things are not going right, when the care is not up to snuff, it's not up to quality levels, that sort of thing, and people don't feel safe saying that increases that moral distress. Remember, anything that goes contrary to our internal values. So if I have the internal value that that all of our residents should feel comfortable and at home, and I'm seeing something that's not happening, and I don't feel like there's a safe way for me to say that anonymously, then my moral distress will increase, and instead of saying something, I might be more likely to just quit and move on, or maybe even worse, to put those things underground and just go through the motions, be robotic about what I'm doing. So we've got to have a non-punitive error reporting system, and making sure that even if you've got a system. So if right now you're saying, well, we've got this X, Y, or Z program where they could put things in, do they know how to access it? Do they know how to use it? Do they know they're not going to get in trouble by saying something? Do you reward the fact that people are calling out errors, or do they feel as though they're risking their job by doing that? So the sixth step, and second to last step for organizations, for leaders, is to have that non-punitive error reporting system in place. Last but not least, and something because you've experienced it, I hope, a way that organizations and workplaces can address burnout is just having support systems. Particularly here, I mean peer support systems, where nurses are coming alongside nurses, aides are coming alongside of aides, where we've got that good sense of camaraderie, everybody having each other's back, supporting each other. What this can mean, whether it's a formal system, you've got a buddy system for every new nurse that comes on, or a mentor system where you provide some sort of incentive for a really great nurse or aide or leader to take that new person under her wing, or whether it's just it's something that's less formal, where people get together sometimes and do social things together and feel like they're connected socially like that. It promotes conversation. So these weighty things that we carry, we don't feel so alone because we're talking about those things with other people. Hopefully not just in a complaining sort of way, but in a sharing what's going on sort of way. It can also normalize reactions. So when something bad happens and I'm feeling this way, and maybe it's the first time I felt this way, but I talk with somebody that's a peer of mine, and they say, yeah, that's happened to me too, and I felt similarly, suddenly I don't feel so abnormal. My reaction feels more normal. Excuse me. And then last but not least, what we see in these peer support networks is a lot of appreciation of support. So it means something when your leader says, I'm glad you're here, I'm so thankful for your service and what you're doing. It means something different when your peer, somebody who's working alongside of you, says, I'm so glad you're still here. I'm glad that these things that have been happening for you haven't led you to quit your job. I want you to stay. And these peer support networks, formal or informal, can help to bring down that really scary number of people who are turning over in healthcare, but particularly in our nursing homes. So these are 7 steps I think organizations really have to take to alleviate and avoid that burnout. Not just because it's the right thing to do or it's the caring thing to do, but because it's the financially responsible, it's the business savvy thing to do. And if there's any of these that you think aren't very shored up in your organization today, I'd take a look at those and see if there's ways that you can move the needle on those to avoid that burnout in your organization.